Sometimes revenge doesn't howl. It murmurs at times. An empire can be destroyed with a single word or decision. Regarding Caitlin for Clark, seeking retribution wasn't about retaliating in interviews or on social media. Her retaliation was really easy. No, she said. No, Geno Auriemma. No to the heritage of UConn. She declined the $1 million offer that suddenly returned to her years later.
Like I said earlier, they actually had odds that, she was like third or fourth in the betting odds to be MVP of the WNBA. That's such a slap in the face to every WNBA player. It's unbelievable, right?
It seems ridiculous on paper. Who would turn down more than $1 million for 8 weeks of hoops? However, this was more than just a contract. It was the lifeline of a man who had previously treated her like an afterthought, ignored her, and denigrated her. When Clark turned it down, she did more than simply give him her money. The man who never believed he could be humiliated was humbled by her.
That's the worst part about new fans. They have no perspective. There's no context. So they just say ridiculous nonsense.
And that is the reason this narrative is more significant. More than basketball. Points, assists, and medals aren't everything. It concerns strength. Geno Auriemma served as women's basketball's gatekeeper for many years. The coach who made the decisions about who was important, who was highlighted, and who was forgotten. However, Caitlin Clark changed the course of events. She didn't require his program, his checkbook, or his approval. Without his help, she established her kingdom. And with the quiet firmness that says, "I don't need you," she turned him away when he eventually made it outside. "I'm necessary to you." Every vengeance tale begins with an error. Geno's wasn't a terrible timeout or a blown play. It was conceit. The height of arrogance. Clark was only a little girl with a dream before she rose to prominence in the sport, before venues were sold out and TV ratings were breaking records. She admitted it candidly. The UConn was the world's coolest place. Tracy, Moore, Stewart, the dynasty, the empire, and the pinnacle of women's basketball. There was nothing greater for a girl growing up in Iowa, and the route appeared clear when it came time for recruitment. Together with the best recruiter the game had ever seen, she was the most captivating talent of her generation. However, the call never arrived. Geno hardly ever answered the phone, never phoned her parents or Clark, and hardly ever sent a message via her AAU coach. That stillness was deafening to the best recruiter of all time. Furthermore, it wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. The message was unambiguous. They didn't prioritize her. His justification was that he didn't want 2 point guards and that UConn had already signed Paige Beckers. Fine on the surface. However, the insult then came. Geno said that she ought to have called Clark if he truly desired UConn. Consider that. Years before anybody else thought Caitlin Clark was worth the effort, the coach who established his reputation on identifying once-in-a-generation talent scolded a teenager for not pursuing him. It wasn't merely a missed opportunity to recruit. It was the kind of rudeness you never forget. Clark discreetly filed it away in exchange. She would go somewhere with someone who did believe in her if Geno didn't. She therefore decided for Iowa, a program devoid of Dynasty Glow mystique or UConn's banners. It appeared to be a consolation reward to many. However, it was liberty for Clark. She wasn't Paige's shadow at Iowa. Geno didn't think of her after the fact. She was the program's recruit, the one who would deliver it. And she changed the storyline as soon as she stepped foot in Iowa City. Her logo threes were statements rather than merely pictures. Her sold-out venues were evidence, not just crowds. Her record-breaking television ratings, they were receipts, not coincidences. All of the baskets, viral highlights, and shattered records served as reminders. You didn't see this. Geno, meantime, doubled down. He relied on his arrogance rather than his humility. Using patronizing sound bites, he dismissed her, referring to her as a child playing in the driveway. He attempted to reduce her genius to something commonplace rather than recognizing her as a force that transcended generations. However, Madison Square Garden doesn't sell out on an average day. The WNBA is not brought into the mainstream by ordinary. You don't have to spend millions on ordinary. And the irony is most acute there. In response to Caitlin Clark's knock, Geno shut the door. He believed she would become simply another talented musician. Rather than him, she created the largest empire in women's basketball history. Clark didn't get angry when he eventually came full circle with the contract in hand. She refrained from gloating. She merely declined. And he lost more than a title ever could because of that one word. Geno Auriemma was powerless to stop himself. He always managed to include Caitlin Clark in the parallels to Paige Becker whenever her name was mentioned. If well, Paige was as fearless as Clark. Paige has the same ability to connect with fans as Clark did. It wasn't arbitrary. It was a plan. Geno maintained his prominence by linking Clark's ascent to his selected players. He wanted everyone to think that her success was a natural byproduct of the dynasty he established. Backhanded praises, however, were thin, and people, fans, analysts, and other coaches saw right through the ruse. Clarification was not necessary for Clark's genius. She was shattering records for the sport, drawing larger audiences than the majority of professional teams, and changing the discourse surrounding women's basketball. But there was Geno quietly holding onto his throne and grinning for the cameras. Insecurity was hiding under the charm, like the one that happens when you can't stop the spotlight from shifting away. Finally, the mask came off. The cunning digs were no longer sufficient. Geno changed her tactics from disparaging Clark to openly attacking her supporters. His tactic has been subtly camouflaged as analysis for months. Then, in an interview with the Dan Patrick Show in June 2024, he made a mistake he would never be able to reverse. Caitlin Clark wasn't the only person questioned by the Hall of Fame coach who was meant to be the face of the best women's basketball team. He pursued her admirers.
The delusional fan base that follows her disrespected the WNBA players by saying she's going to go in that league and tear it apart. There were actually odds on she's third or fourth in betting odds on being MVP at the WNBA. These people are so disrespectful and so unknowledgeable and so stupid that it gives women's basketball a bad name. Okay, so the kid was set up for failure right from the beginning.
He didn't mince words. He referred to those who supported her as insane. They didn't comprehend the game, he claimed. Then, incredibly, he said that they were harming women's basketball because they were so dumb. What offense were they guilty of? Thinking Clark as a rookie might claim the MVP award. That wasn't passion to Geno. It was foolishness. Diana put it best. This child is about to get an unpleasant awakening. Take a moment to consider that. Clark had just brought millions of new viewers to women's basketball. Families in jerseys were arriving. Children were setting up camp to greet her. For the first time, casual fans were watching WNBA broadcasts. Furthermore, Geno's response was an insult rather than an expression of appreciation or pleasure. He made fun of the surge of fresh energy rather than embracing it. This was not an analysis. A coach wasn't dissecting strengths and flaws in this way. It was a personal matter. It was a direct attack on the vitality of Clark's motion, the same individuals that had introduced women's basketball to the public attention. Geno is criticizing not only Clark, but also the supporters who enabled her ascent. And everybody paid attention because he is Geno Auriemma. His remarks were hurtful and revealing because they were weighted. Not only did he undervalue her admirers when he called them clueless, she was underestimated by him. He claimed that the excitement was unfounded, that he would ultimately be shown to be correct, and that the success wasn't sustainable. However, this is when the tale becomes delectable. Geno was mistaken. He was far from it. On Twitter, Clark did not respond. Interviews weren't cut by her. She was not required to. The court, the one venue that mattered, was where she responded. And it wasn't merely confirmation that came next. The credibility of Geno was completely destroyed. Rookie of the Year went to Caitlin Clark. She continued after that. She made the first team of the WNBA. She also came in precisely 4th place when the votes for MVP were tallied. She was exactly where her allegedly naive followers had expected her to be. Geno chuckled at a prediction that turned out to be true. His authority also disintegrated with it. Clark's victory wasn't the only one. It served as retribution for her supporters, whom he had disparaged and humiliated. Geno brushed off as an issue every parent who took their child to see her, every casual admirer who tuned in, and every new fan who fell for the buzz. Clark demonstrated their prophecy. The best part is that she accomplished it silently. Silent retaliation. No drama, no argument, no tirade, just outcomes. Night after night, she gave performances that defied justification. Highlight reels were illuminated by assists, logo threes, and crossovers that stopped defenders in their tracks. There was no argument when the awards were announced. Without mentioning his name, she had hushed him. Is there any poetry in that? Geno had established himself as the guardian of women's basketball expertise, the knowledgeable senior who understood the game better than anyone else, even the media and spectators. However, the supporters were correct. Clark was correct. Geno was mistaken. He was no longer the kingmaker, as seen by every venue she sold out, record she broke, and honor she received. He wasn't necessary for her. She didn't. This is where the irony lies. Clark had no intention of disproving Geno. She wasn't trying to win his favor. She wasn't even considering him. She was simply acting like Caitlin Clark. And that was sufficient to make him public, humble him, and demonstrate to the world that he was no longer in charge of the story. By the conclusion of her first year, she was. Whether Clark had lived up to the hype wasn't the only consideration. It had to do with how thoroughly she had dispelled every uncertainty. Geno's taunts didn't hold up over time. They grew older like milk in the sun. His remarks regarding her supporters now rank among the worst in sports history. Resentful, insecure, and shamefully incorrect. However, Geno was unable to let go. He could not bear the thought of being incorrect. It was more than just Clark's game by this point. It was about what she stood for, the shift in power, the changing of the guard, and the indisputable fact that he was no longer the center of women's basketball. And he did what he always does rather than accept it. He continued to speak, podcast after podcast, interview after interview. Her name was always close to his lips. And every time the pattern recurred, there was a little compliment accompanied by a disclaimer, a little dig, or some praise. However, it became more apparent the more he spoke. Caitlin Clark was doing more than simply revising the books of records. Geno Auriemma was living rentrée in his mind. Words were no longer sufficient at one point. With cunning comparisons, backhanded praise, and jabs at Clark's supporters, Geno Auriemma has spent months attempting to mold the story. However, Clark's influence continued to decline while he continued to win and shine. So he turned around. Perhaps he could use money to dominate the story if he couldn't achieve it with his words. That is how the offer of $1 million was made. Geno tried everything by that point. When he was a teenager, he disregarded her. He dismissed her ascent. He disparaged those who supported her. He attempted to portray her fame as merely another effect of the Yukon dynasty. It didn't work. Geno continued to fade as Clark continued to climb. Then an opportunity presented itself in the form of cash signs. Supported by Breanna Stewart and Anfisa Collier, the 3-on-3 Women's League is a brand new, unmatched endeavor. The league had ambition because Geno was heavily active behind the scenes. Although it had money, it lacked the most important component, a face.
And there's a lot of investors in this league. One investor, been trying to keep quiet about, his investment in the league ever since his comments that he made about a young rookie. Pretty much, had him in the headlines for about a month and a half. That is Geno Auriemma, dog. I'm here to tell you, he's part owner of this league.
At that point, the desperation became evident. Because only one person could instantly lend the initiative legitimacy despite the involvement of all the other players. Millions of supporters, media partners, and sponsors might be attracted by a single athlete. Only one celebrity possessed the gravitational pull necessary to transform an unmatched player into a legitimate WNBA competitor. Caitlin Clark was that star. Geno then took the unimaginable action. He knocked! According to reports, the league awarded Clark one of the largest contracts ever offered in women's basketball. More than $1 million for an 8-week season. Take a moment to process that. The coach, who had previously refused to answer the phone when she was being recruited, was now almost pleading with her to preserve his new league. The same individual who claimed that her buzz was unfounded was now attempting to make money off of it. The coach, who referred to her fans as delusional, now required those same people to purchase tickets and webcast his games. It was deliciously ironic.
This one looked like Geno Auriemma. Could be the reason why Caitlin Clark is definitely not joining the unrivaled 3-on-3 basketball league.
This was more than simply business, don't get me wrong. It was a personal matter. Geno could change the narrative if he managed to land Clark. He could argue that her ascent was still dependent on his authority, vision, and method. Instead of portraying her as a sign of the fall of the empire he established, he could show her as an extension of it. Clark, however, was not duped. She saw no opportunity when the contract landed on her desk. After years of attempting to reduce her, she perceived a test, a desperate attempt to gain authority.
They've tried to do everything they could to make the most of the situation. They tried to make the most of Caitlin Clark not playing by hinting everything and basically making people think that Caitlin Clark was going to play.
She responded quickly and devastatedly. No. One word that was more significant than all of Geno's interviews put together. No justifications, no hesitancy, no hedging. She wasn't in need of his cash. His platform wasn't necessary for her. She didn't require his blessing. The man who had previously dismissed her was now requesting assistance. And she declined with a shame that was more profound than any retort could possibly be. No, the humiliation was finished at that point. The gatekeeper, Geno Auriemma, who made his name by identifying and developing talent, had been reduced to giving the one player he had fired a fortune. And she rejected him outright, silently, firmly, and without drama or resentment. Just rejection. The consequences were severe. Unrivaled lost its appeal, focal point, and legitimacy without Clark. The $1 million offer was more of an admission of weakness than a display of strength. She never needed the project as much as it needed her, and the excitement vanished before it had barely begun when she left. The audience was fully aware of what they were witnessing. Following years of maltreatment, Geno was ridiculed and laughed at on social media for believing Clark would ever save him. One move terminated the chess game he believed he was directing. Furthermore, Clark didn't even perspire. She refrained from ranting. She didn't pull him along. Beyond her choice, she didn't even acknowledge him. She simply left. Furthermore, the quiet was more painful than any words could be. Because this is the reality. The days of Geno are past. He has lost his power. Furthermore, Caitlin Clark did more than simply overthrow him. She completely destroyed the throne. Geno and the establishment determined who was important in women's basketball for many years. They were in charge of the opportunities, the stories, and the routes. You had to go through them if you wanted to be great. Clark, however, destroyed that paradigm. She was validated without UConn's banners. Geno's approval was not necessary for her to shine. She started from zero and developed her empire. And she made a strong statement by turning down his multi-million-dollar offer. The players, not the gatekeepers, own the future. This is the reason Geno finds this narrative so painful. Ignoring Clark as a recruit was not his worst error. His biggest error was presuming that without him, the sport couldn't advance. He believed that he was essential. She demonstrated his insignificance. Furthermore, he wasn't the only one who was humiliated. It served as a warning to all executives, coaches, and power brokers who were still holding on to the appearance of dominance. There was more to Clark's refusal than just personal retaliation. It was cultural. It signaled a change in authority, a boundary between the new and the old guard. She demonstrated to a whole generation of athletes that they can lead without acceptance, validation, or permission. They have the star power, the numbers, and the fans to forge their own route. And she used the most basic of tools, a single no, to demonstrate it. Thus, perhaps the adage is incorrect. Perhaps it's not the finest idea to exact revenge, Cole. One rejection that reveals the depth of your enemy's need may be the sweetest form of silent, peaceful retaliation. Caitlin Clark rejected Geno's methodology, his authority, and his entire worldview in addition to rejecting a contract. By doing this, she not only prevailed but also altered the rules of the game. Does Geno deserve it in your opinion? Tell us in the comments section. Turn on all notifications, like and subscribe to ensure you don't miss anything.